Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I can't see you, so I'm just going to assume everybody's here. Good afternoon. I'm Mickalene Gallagher. I'm the director of Sunnylands Center and Gardens, and today I get to welcome you to the City of Rancho Mirage Library for a talk from Sunnylands. Normally at this time of year, we're talking about a new exhibition, and we've been playing a little bit with having some exhibitions go longer than a year. So last year, you heard about the current one, the William Haynes exhibition. It's gone a second year. So our director of heritage had been going through a lot of information and came up with a new story that we want to share with you today. And this is about the follies at Sunnylands. So we thank you all for coming. I can see you now. So I do want to ask, how many of you have been there for the current exhibition, have seen that? Oh, fabulous. If you haven't, you have until June, and then it's gone. So you want to come over there. All right, well, thank you. Welcome. And I now introduce Rowe, our Director of Heritage.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here on such a beautiful day. Really happy to see all of you. How many of you have not been to Sunnylands? Okay, a few people. Okay, great. Good to know. All right, so even though we're not outside on this beautiful day, our journey today, digitally, is going to be all outdoors, pretty much. Okay, so we're going to follow in the Annenberg's footsteps today and see how they curated their vast grounds. But before we take off on our journey, I'll do a brief overview of this unique place called Sunnylands, for those of you who haven't been, its original landscape design, and then we'll have a walkabout. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Sunnylands is a 1966 estate designed by architect A. Quincy Jones. It's in the heart of what is now Rancho Mirage. The estate is 200 acres and includes a golf course. Sunnylands is the former winter home of Philadelphia-based Leonore and Walter Annenberg. They enjoyed their estate for 40-plus years, and then they generously left their home to a public trust. The estate is actively used today, guided by very specific aspirational programming that the Annenbergs carefully defined for us. I'll outline that in just a moment. So here's an aerial view showing Sunnyland's green landscape on the left. And notice the rectangular property on the right, adjacent to the estate. That is our visitor center, called the Sunnylands Center and Gardens. This visitor hub acts as an interpretive center for Sunnylands and as a depot to the historic estate. The center houses a cafe, a movie theater, an exhibition gallery, a gift shop, all of the museum-like activities that you would expect to see at a national historic site. It's open free to the public. So the first of the Annenberg's approved usages for the estate is to provide educational opportunities and access to the public. The visitor center building and property facilitates our achieving that public programming goal. The center building itself was designed by architect Fred Fisher. So both the estate and the visitor center opened to the public in 2012. Mrs. Annenberg passed away in 2009. The other primary activity that the Annenbergs specified for their home is that we continue to make their estate available as a bilateral meeting space to all former and future presidents of the United States, as they themselves had done during their lifetimes. In fact, a total of 8 presidents of the United States have spent time at Sunnylands, and they wanted us to continue this tradition that evolved very naturally and organically during their desert stays. Beyond presidential level meetings, they also wanted their home to be activated as a venue in service of other leaders and innovators working for the greater good. So over our first 13 years, we've actively achieved this goal, and we continue to do so nearly every week in season. So that's Sunnyland's mission in just a nutshell. So we have the public side and we have a private side. So now let's look at the design of the landscape. The Sunnylands landscape was designed as a private parkland, sited to maximize the valley's world-class views. The Annenbergs had a knack. They were very talented. They were a power couple. They were very cool. I've been in their archives for 15 years. I can tell you they always were trying to do the best they could for the best things for the planet and everyone. And one thing they were very good at was finding the best-in-class experts to partner with for their projects. So for Sunnylands, they chose architect A. Quincy Jones, who would go on to be the Dean of Architecture at USC, and they brought in the famous decorator William Haynes. These two rascals had already assembled a triumphant body of work at this later stage in their careers, including in the Palm Springs area. Jones was 50, and Haynes was 63 when they got that Sunnylands call. The Annenbergs knew this was a dream team for Sunnylands. So why, if we're talking landscape today, am I mentioning the architect of the house and the interior designer? Well, because they were actually the true drivers of the entire project. Their fingerprints are on every aspect of this estate. Jones sited the house in the center of the property, which features a walk-on golf course. The fairways splay off the house toward the southern and western views. Decorator Haynes once said, quote, "The interior decorator, the landscape gardener, and the architect should all be consulted right from the beginning. They should work together before they present anything to the client," end quote. And that is indeed exactly how Sunnylands was designed and built. Dick Wilson was brought in to design the 9-hole golf course, which can be played as 18 holes. Wilson designed over 60 courses in his life, and they have stellar reputations. The house itself is raised up on broad terraces, supported by sloped concrete retaining walls that allude to Mayan architecture, a theme that the Annenbergs brought to the architect table. The house is surrounded by water. There are 11 man-made lakes with connecting streams. Their understanding in 1966 was that there was an abundant aquifer allowing for that much water to circulate and be used for irrigation. So we've worked over the first 15 years to cut that turf nearly in half, and we relined the lakes and have cut the water usage considerably. But beyond the aesthetic purposes for waterways, they specifically wanted Sunnylands to be a sanctuary for birds. Walter and Leonore were avid birders and keenly aware that their new home would intersect with the migratory bird path along the Pacific Flyway. They wanted to provide a place for birds to touch down, and they succeeded. As of April 2024, more than 170 species of birds have been spotted on the estate. Michelina and her colleagues in education keep a bird list. In fact, you saw a new one just like a week ago, right? Yeah. So here's just a few of the birds that touched down on Sunnylands. During the plant and build years, from 1963 to 66, hundreds of trees were planted in loose rows and clusters, including 700 olive trees. And today, there are about 660 olive trees, and we do harvest and produce olive oil from these trees. Walter and Leonore were super active participants on every aspect of this project, including plant material. And that's Walter there in the shorts on the platform, surveying his open sand. Walter and architect Jones and decorator Haynes wrote letters to each other about trees before the estate was completed. They curated the tree collection like the Annenbergs curated their art collection, with thoughtful consideration and in pursuit of rarity. So before we set out to see how they curated the grounds with objects and small buildings, indulge me just for a second in a quick definition sidebar. When I set off on researching the ground sculpture, I thought they were called follies, but I discovered that the strict definition of a folly is actually a fake ruin. Follies, technically, are historicized garden buildings without function. ChatGPT says that a landscape folly refers to a structure that is built in a landscape for aesthetic or ornamental purposes, rather than for any functional use whatsoever. So follies are delightful for the eye, but by definition, inherently impractical. Well, I'm here to tell you the Annenbergs were practical. They demonstrated no interest in building useless structures or fake ruins of any kind. So even though I like the word folly, I just wanted to mention that common expansion of the definition, just in case there's some purists in the audience. Okay, so here we go. These little bridges, these were not added later by the Annenbergs, but I just wanted to give them a quick shout out and to say hello to them as we head out on our tour. Architect Jones designed 4 of these elegant little bridges to gently rise and fall across the brooks that twirl around the house. These minimalist structures are heavily used. They are super functional. They allow golf carts and those walking about a way to cross the many waterways that swirl around the main house. Architect Jones called them overpasses with a Japanese character, and I just adore these little spans. I also want to stop by and say hello to this minimalist tennis pavilion, also drawn by Jones's office. This simple structure provides a lot: a step-up viewing deck, shade for spectators, and a place for players to sit between sets. I just love the structure. It's simple, but it has some interesting details like those offset columns. The pavilion furniture is custom and was designed by decorator William Haynes. And I think you might agree that form follows function in the design of this lovely little pavilion. And here's a vintage photo of spectators enjoying the pavilion. Okay, so now let's go see the land art. The first artwork that the Annenbergs added to the grounds was this bronze column-shaped fountain. In this early architectural model, we see that a vertical obelisk of some sort was imagined from the earliest concepts for the circular driveway. And I really wish I knew what happened to that model. I don't know where that lives, not at Sunnylands. This vintage photo shows us that the hardscape, the landscape, and water to hook up were in place and ready to receive some sort of fountain. The Annenbergs made a scrapbook of a trip they took to Mexico in 1967, just following the completion of the house. They took a lot of great tourist photos on that trip, but mostly, you guys, there are a lot of photos of fountains. Here's one of many fountains they photographed, and there were a ton of photos of this fountain. And here's another. And they took this photo of a famous grasshopper fountain in Mexico City. And when you're at this site in Chapultepec Park, you can see something in the distance. Notice rising above the tree line, there's a hardscape cabled column. A hardscape and a cabled column. So those cables are stealthily holding up this roof over the patio at Mexico's National Museum of Anthropology. The cables bear the weight, which allows the roof to appear to be floating, balanced on that central column. And that column underneath is breathtaking and is, in fact, a fountain. The museum opened in 1964. So at the same time the Annenbergs were building their Mayan fantasy here in Rancho Mirage, this important museum was being erected in Mexico. And the carved story on that column is fascinating. The carvings on the column are narrative and chronological, documenting the history of Mexico from its ancient mythical past to the modern age. The Annenbergs had to have been overwhelmed to see this column. I can just imagine them thinking that a smaller scale version could be perfect for Sunnylands if only the artists would do another. When the Annenbergs returned to California, they immediately corresponded with the architect of the museum to see if it would be possible and appropriate to connect with the artists to commission a second fountain. The Annenbergs commissioned from the artist the exact same column with the exact same carved narrative, but in a 20-foot version for their house. The artists of the column, brothers Jose and Tomas Chavez Morado, were art stars in Mexico. The brothers Chavez Morado worked with the modern architects in Mexico, creating murals and carved adornments for buildings, such as these lovely panels on this modern hospital. As Mexico modernized, the architects did something really special. The mid-century architects brought their ancient ancestors with them into the modern era through these applied artworks. Noted Mexican architect Ricardo Legarreta called this Mexican artistic style of fusing ancient iconography and modern narratives through art on buildings as, quote, the convergence of rootedness and innovation. Here, Jose and Tomas depicted healing techniques for indigenous children shown on the right and a modern medical scene on the left, rootedness and innovation. You can see they're fusing the modern and ancient motifs throughout their work, and their work is stunning and found all through Mexico. They blended the modern artistic styles with that traditional Mexican iconography, I think in a very exciting way. So the carvings on the column at the museum and Sunnylands are the exact same. So let's just look at a couple of the carvings to see what the story is. The symbol of Mexico is an eagle with a serpent in its mouth. You can see that emblem on the nation's flag on the right. Notice on the column, Mexico, which is the eagle, is supported by two men's heads. The faces include an indigenous person on the left and on the right, a Spaniard representing the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s. So this picture illustrates that the modern people of Mexico are an integration of indigenous bloodlines and Spanish bloodlines. So this is a strong political statement broadcasting equality and integration for the people of Mexico. On the other side of the column, we see the innovation narrative. In the final carving, we find a man with arms wide open in a vulnerable, peaceful stance. Around the man are other symbols of peace, a dove and olive branches. This is a postcard of peace from Mexico to the world. And the symbols of peace stand atop an atomic energy symbol, representing the modern future. So this final message on this Mexican column is a call for peace in the modern era. It's a powerful and beautiful statement. The Annenbergs chose this socio-political message for their home before Walter became the U.S. ambassador to the UK in '69 and before Leonore became chief of protocol for the United States in 1981. So that they were drawn to this diplomacy through art narrative while mere civilians really speaks to their world perspective that they later brought to their appointments to serve our country. Walter and Leonore worked with anthropologists in Mexico City to interpret every carving. They published a little pamphlet, and they placed that pamphlet in every guest's room so everyone could understand the story on the column. And today, our house tour guides tell the story of the column before welcoming guests into the house. When guests arrive at Sunnylands by car, they enter through the fancy gates on Frank Sinatra Drive, and they hit the gas, and they go up a steep hill toward the house. The pink roof of the house slowly reveals itself, as does a sculpture called Birds of Welcome. This modernist sculpture depicts a group of 7 stylized metal birds, patinated in alternating bronze and aluminum tones. The Annenberg's modern bird sculpture is the 2nd edition. The original version of Birds of Welcome was and is still installed in the International Lounge at Gander Airport in Newfoundland. It was installed in '58. The Annenbergs traveled frequently through Gander to refuel on their way to and from London. So they admired this sculpture of birds in the terminal. Walter wrote directly to the artist to commission a similar sculpture. Walter later said, quote, "I had seen this particular sculpture at the center of the airport at Gander and was impressed with the spirit of it." You can just imagine the impact this charming sculpture would have on 2 birders with 200 acres of grounds to curate back home in California. The Sunnylands version was made from new molds, so it's not identical to the original Gander casting. The artist, Art Price, was born in Edmonton, Canada, and was a prolific and successful artist. And here he's shown with the Annenberg's version. And the Annenbergs carefully sited this charming sculpture in a place to welcome their guests along the drive to the front door. So after passing the Birds of Welcome, the car's headlights then turn right into the face of the Mexican column on the circular drive. So 2 international gestures of welcome have already been experienced before guests reach the front door. I find this a stunning and thoughtfully curated arrival sequence. And I'm told that Gander's Airport Birds of Welcome is still there, welcoming guests, as is Sunnyland's version. Okay, so their next move was to recite a metal sculpture that was already in their art collection. So in 1973, their 1961 sculpture was moved from inside to outside. And that sculpture is named Peacock and is by renowned artist and designer Harry Bertoia. Bertoia was, of course, a sculptor and designer known for many things, including jewelry, chairs, and kinetic sculpture. Bertoia often depicted nature in his sculpture, as shown in this tree example. Peacock is, of course, an abstracted depiction of a bird. The Annenbergs purchased Peacock from a friend who was a dean at the University of Pennsylvania. The dean sold it to them because he was moving to a smaller house and he didn't have room for it. Can you imagine your neighbor asking if you want to buy their Bertoia? They said yes. So Peacock has quite a wingspan at 7 feet tall by 6 feet wide. So it does require a large space, which Sunnylands certainly has. So Peacock migrated from Philadelphia to Sunnylands and enjoyed about 5 years inside the house. So interestingly, Sunnylands was designed without a formal dining room. In 1973, the Annenbergs decided to change this. They ditched this billiard room and they turned it into a dining room. And they pushed that slider out about 10 feet, and they raised that outdoor trellis. And they enlisted Peacock to be the outdoor art star in this renovation. So this placement, I think, is just lovely, and I think it's clever also. Peacock looks great outdoors in natural light. It looks great at night when it's lit. and it gently obscures the view of the guest wing and the locker rooms. So when they created their formal dining room, I think it was a really interesting choice to put peacock there. Architect Harry Saunders from A. Quincy Jones's office stepped in to expand that dining room and added peacock outside. Architect Jones had passed away by this time, and Saunders continued to work with the Annenbergs on estate tweaks for years. And Saunders did something pretty cool when he relocated Peacock. He sought approval from Bertoia. He sent this drawing to Bertoia with photographs of the site. Bertoia was quite pleased with the project, elevating Peacock to be the star in this tableau. Bertoia wrote back and said, quote, "The drawing of the pavilion where you intend to place Peacock shows what a handsome setting you are providing," end quote. So outdoor diners also get to enjoy Peacock's radiant glow. Seasonal flowers are maintained in the planter, further enhancing this wonderful kinetic bird who moves gently in the breeze. Okay, so Peacock found a permanent home outdoors, and now let's go visit the western edge of the property. A few years later, the Annenbergs set their sights on commissioning a totem pole from Canada. The Annenbergs then did what they did very well. They researched totem poles and carvers for quite some years, actually, and they eventually commissioned a new pole from the famous quaggadle carver Henry Hunt. Henry Hunt was a 3-time First Nations chief from Vancouver Island. They identified, if not the greatest living artist in West Coast carving, certainly one of the elite carvers. The Hunt family are interesting in a lot of ways. Not only are they art stars, but they're also credited as the family who actively continues to preserve quaggadle history, language, customs, songs, and material culture through their personal stewardship, even when it was not forbidden to do so. The Sunnylands totem pole is created from a 30-foot log of red cedar, and it's a popular artwork for visitors to the estate, including, you can see here, George H.W. Bush on the left and Margaret Thatcher in the right photo. The Annenbergs sought a tall beacon of some sort for the west end of the property, which could help golfers navigate the very long 5th hole on the golf course. Commissioning an authentic West Coast totem, I think, was an inspired idea. The pole was weathered when the trust began managing the estate. So the son of the carver, Stan, and his family came down from Canada to restore their father's work. And we learned a lot about the pole directly from them. Stan told us that the top figure on his dad's pole is a self-portrait. The figure wears a chief's hat, and it has 3 rings on it. So this represents Henry's 3-time chief status, something we might not have ever figured out. And notice the chief carved himself wearing a beautiful Chilkat yellow blanket and is holding tight to a little geometric figure with a face. Well, this figure is called a copper, and it represents money. And I'll get back to that in a second. Stan also told us that the choice of which figures a North Coast carver is allowed to carve is dependent on the crests, they're called crests, these figures, that the family owns and therefore has a right to carve them. All the figures on the Sunnylands pole are therefore creatures or people or spirits that are owned by the Hunt family. These crests are inherited, and they're also passed down, and they can also be acquired through marriage. Stan told us that his parents' wedding was like a royal wedding because it brought together many important crests. So given that a totem pole and its figures are owned by a family, totem poles are literally family trees. This bear shown here is holding a seal, and of course these are both Hunt family crests. Stan said most carvers know better than to carve crests that aren't their own, that are their own, but some break the rules, but he said, we know when they do that. He said, our family never does that. So here's a close-up of that beautiful bear's freshly painted face. And the cracks in the wood, you guys, I asked about those, and they said they intentionally leave them alone to let the water just go right through. If they start mucking with the cracks, they're afraid they'll create little spaces for water to sit in. This whistling figure is a scary, wild witch of the woods. Notice she's also carved holding tight to a copper, a signal of money. And Stan laughed when he told me about this. He said it was probably his dad being witty and referencing the Annenberg's wealth to have put 2 coppers on 1 pole. Another thing we might not have ever understood. Following their restoration, the family rededicated the newly raised pole in a traditional ceremony, and this was one of our first public education programs. There was a private blessing of the pole, and the extended family brought textiles and carvings to share with the public following the ceremony. Hunt family carvings were featured later in an exhibition at the Center and Gardens, alongside carvings and paintings by contemporary artist and musician Herb Alpert, shown on the lower left, surrounded by his own paintings and sculpture. Alpert had said in public many times how his artwork was directly inspired by Quagudal and other North Coast carvers, and so we brought these artists together in dialogue. In fact, Herb fell in love with the desert, as we all do, and he's creating and soon to be opening an art space in Palm Springs. Stay tuned for that. And here's a photo from that exhibition. It was a very exciting show to produce, to bring such disparate artists together in a harmonious conversation, and the artists just really clicked and they remain friends today. Okay, in the late 70s, the Annenbergs began collecting art by trailblazing kinetic artist Yaakov Agam. They added 4 major pieces to the patios at Sunnylands. So how did their collecting flurry begin? Well, in 1976, the newly built Palm Springs Art Museum opened to the public. This fabulous new building, designed by architect E. Stewart Williams. He's shown on the left there. The building was and is a beloved triumph in Palm Springs. And the inaugural exhibition for this new museum building featured the works of Yaakov Agam. And who was president of the museum board at this time? Leonore Annenberg. So the Annenbergs got to know Agam and his work through this project. Artworks were displayed inside the museum as well as outdoors, shown here on the right. The Annenbergs fell hard for Agam's work, including this beauty. They acquired this kinetic sculpture, which was featured in the exhibition. The raised pink planter by their pool was previously built for planting flowers. Well, the flowers went away, and in came the sculpture. And square waves fits perfectly on that planter. So Agam enjoyed a surge of popularity in the desert following the exhibition, and his work is actually represented in many desert collections. And maybe you've actually even seen it at Eisenhower Hospital. You'll maybe notice them now. They're scattered throughout the valley. So let's see if I can make this little video work. Oh yeah, there we go. So it's tubular steel, and each piece just moves independently. And do we have to scooch it back into place now and then? Yes, we do. So the Annenbergs, as curators, enjoyed witty, clever juxtapositions when installing their art. They had fun with the names of artworks and understood the power of context for art placement. So installing an artwork called Square Waves near water is completely aligned with the sense of fun that they brought to placing their art. Following Square Waves, they commissioned a painting for the patio directly from Agam. So this piece was not in the exhibition, but they started working with him on private commissions. You can see this beautiful painting on the south patio with Agam and Walter Annenberg. And here you can see the painting there under the chimney. I think this is such a bold choice, to have just a very clean, very spare, if you will, modern sort of landscape here, and then to insert this pretty aggressive painting. And just to show you what that painting looks like, lit and restored, here are 3 views of the same painting. So depending on what angle you view it from, the piece completely changes. So we call this kinetic artwork because it moves, but it's really the person moving, not the artwork moving. And it works because it's corrugated metal. So there's a few sides to paint on. So it's pretty fabulous in person. A year later, another large format Agam painting was commissioned, and it is called Situations. This stunning piece was also hung outside, and you can see it right there behind Leonore. She's here entertaining folks in the dining room, including Gerald Ford, who's listening intensely to someone. And then you can see a little peek of it in the background there. And here's Agam himself posing with the piece in his atelier. He's an Israeli artist, but I believe he's still living in Paris, and he's 96 years old. And here's Situations, 2 different views of the same artwork. And here's a gallery photo showing both Situations and the painting called Sunnylands when we exhibited them in an Agam exhibition at the center. They also commissioned a painting called Expended Space, which they also hung on a patio wall. So this is a painting on mirror, and it's shown being removed in 2010. And I just couldn't find any archival photos of this installation, so thank goodness I grabbed this quick shot when the guys were moving it off the wall for me. So in this photo, you can see it sort of in the background there. But yeah, I don't have a lot of archival photos of it. And here's that piece, 3 different views depending on where you stand. And here's a photograph of square waves in the center and gardens during the Agam exhibition. Following the exhibition, the sun-proof square waves was returned poolside, but the paintings remain out of the sun in storage until the next opportunity to display them. All right, so while the Annenbergs were busy commissioning paintings from Agam, they were also designing a new structure, a new place to sit with friends, and they named it the Chinese Pavilion. The Chinese term for landscape is shan shui, and it literally means mountains and water. With that in mind, they nestled their Chinese pavilion right near an estate lake and on a site that has breathtaking mountain views. The Annenbergs enhanced a few hospitality elements when they returned from England. They created that very formal dining room. They built 3 new guest rooms, which we'll talk about in a future talk, and they added this Chinese-inspired pavilion at which to host guests on the grounds. According to Sunnylands staff, the pavilion was regularly used by Walter and Leonore, including as a perfect place for lunch during a round of golf. According to the former estate manager, quote, "The ladies usually started playing at 10 on Golf Tuesdays. They played 9 holes before enjoying a lunch at the pavilion, where they discussed many topics. They were served iced tea, tea sandwiches, and little cookies. Then they headed back to the golf course to play another 9 holes." Leonore referred to the pavilion as Walter's Folly. And I can see why. Walter was very thoughtful about landscape. In fact, once he wrote a very tender letter to President Gerald Ford and said, quote, "The ancient Chinese philosophers believed that reverence of the landscape is the highest ideal in life." So I think it's really sweet that she called that Walter's Folly. And here we see a grandchild making good use of the pavilion for a game of parcheesi. So the Annenbergs once again asked their architect, Harry Saunders, who designed Peacock's Pavilion, to now design this lovely pavilion. Luckily, we have a very thick vintage file on the pavilion containing so much delightful material. And some of it, by the way, came from Saunders' estate. When he passed away, his family reached out to us and said, "He has a lot of Sunnylands things. Do you want them for your archives?" And we said, yes, please. So we have so much good material. we found this catalog of roof tiles. They chose handmade ancient-style roof tiles that were imported from Japan. The company, Daibutsu, is still in business. I Googled them. And they still make what they call smoked tiles using traditional methods. The pavilion features a built-in pink marble table and seating for 8. And notice that this furniture drawing is from the office of William Haynes, Interior Design. Haynes, like Jones, had passed away by this time, but his partner, Ted Graeber, would have likely designed this stone furniture. So we see the second generation in these two offices continuing to work together at Sunnylands. I love all the doodles and the working out of fretwork ideas. And you can see how Saunders integrated a geometric frieze into the building. The Annenbergs were scholarly in their approach to everything they did. They read a lot of books, magazines, and newspapers, and they had clip files that related to objects of interest. This clipping I especially love, given that hospitality was the name of the game at Sunnylands as well. So it's no wonder that this article was snatched from the newspaper and saved. They saved painted color samples. And with all of the elaborate details available to them, I think they showed great restraint in keeping the building fairly modest in both decoration and scale. When you have that many acres, this could have gotten out of control. I admire their restraint here. The pavilion was designed with an adjacent concrete sundial, shown on the left here in the sketch. Many, many handwritten calculations to calibrate the sundial were in the file. This is before Google. And good news, the sundial does tell time perfectly. And lunch continues to be served on occasion at the pavilion. And the pavilion is a stop on our open-air experience tours at Sunnylands, which provide an alternate tour route to the interior of the house. And so even though it was nicknamed Walter's Folly, form followed function. The pavilion was thoughtfully designed, purposefully built, beautifully sited, and was regularly put to good use. Okay, a couple of years after the pavilion was added, another structure at which to sit and enjoy the great outdoors was added to the landscape, and it's called the Delos Bench. In 1978, the Annenbergs and friends cruised the Greek islands on a private yacht. The tour included an amble onto Delos, which is an island near Mykonos. Delos is a UNESCO World Heritage Site given its ancient ruins and rich history. The Annenberg party enjoyed a walkabout through the famous Delos ruins. And they posed for a photograph on an ancient marble bench. Once they returned home to Sunnylands, the Annenbergs reached out to their architect, Saunders, to create a version of the classical bench that they admired on Delos. And Saunders delivered. He created a classical half-moon design with a step-up. Former staff told us that the marble slabs used to construct the bench arrived individually by helicopter and were gently set right here at the building site. This avoided having trucks destroy the immaculate fairways. The staff also told us that Leonore very much enjoyed the bench, but not the view of the bench from the house. And here's that bench location in relation to the pool patios. And here's a closer look. And as you've seen, the Delos bench is, shall we say, aggressively landscaped to achieve Leonore's request to obscure the view of the bench. And I get it. I think I get it. She wanted to just see green and nature and birds and not maybe a white marble plain. So we've continued that tradition today. It's a lovely nook, actually. It's called the Delos Alcove, and you can spend some time alone there or with many friends. With the addition of the bench, the Annenbergs inserted a new gathering space deeper out into the landscape, a new view of the mountains that constantly change. And of course, another thing is added now to their landscape directly influenced by what they saw in their travels. Okay, the final 3 landscape artworks that we're going to look at are all mysteries. The first 2 are this pair of cranes. These Japanese bronze cranes, perched lakeshore, are magnificent. Each individual feather is carved in relief. Standing nearly 9 feet tall, this towering pair remain a mystery because we haven't found any paperwork, nothing, nada, zippo. A bilingual tour guide at Sunnylands translated the Japanese characters for us that are etched on the necks of the cranes. And it turns out it's a maker's mark, which simply reads, "Made by Yoshida." And this could possibly mean that the cranes were made in the bronze workshop of Yoshida in Kyoto. We're not sure. Research continues. Given that the Annenbergs were fastidious about retaining artwork, receipts, and paperwork in general, the lack of provenance for these beauties suggests maybe they were a gift, whether to each other or from a friend or colleague, we don't know. The daughters don't know. They just always remember them being there. And so we're not sure from where they came, but they're certainly well aligned with the decorative collection at Sunnylands. The Annenbergs, you guys, collected a lot of pairs of cranes. Specifically, they collected pairs of red-crowned cranes. I love this fine Chinese cloisonné pair. So remember, the Annenbergs were both major birders, so they were drawn to bird form artworks in general, but especially this species. And I wonder if this targeted focus on this species might have something to do with the notion that these birds mate for life and so are entwined forever. In Asian art, pairs of red-crowned cranes symbolize longevity, fidelity, luck, and marital harmony. So given that the Annenbergs researched all of their art, I can see how this connotation would have appealed to this happy couple. Colleagues from the Getty helped us date the cranes. Through metal testing, the cranes were dated to the Meiji period, which is 1868 to 1912 in that pocket. So I'm hopeful that someday we will find the story of the cranes in archives, but for the time being, their flight from Japan is still a mystery. Okay, our final artwork on our grounds tour today is also a bit of a mystery, although, unlike the cranes, we did find some paperwork related to this seated girl. When we, the employees of the Trust, arrived on campus in 2009, we found this lovely girl sitting outside one of the guest cottages. Finding her here was a complete surprise, the last thing we expected to find on a modern estate. Staff on site told us that the marble was a gift to Walter from his father, Moses. So the lack of any acquisition paperwork for this sculpture certainly supports the gift theory and that oral history that we learned from the staff. To prepare for public access, we undertook a multiple-year restoration project across the estate. So when she was moved into storage for safekeeping, I asked the crew if they could please tip her so we could see if there were any markings, such as a signature or a gallery sticker or perhaps initials, anything really on the underside to give us a clue. But there was nothing. 7 years later, we found a shipping file that told us a little bit about her. We found a letter that Walter wrote in 1966 about a white marble sculpture of a girl he had in storage in Philadelphia. That's where he and Leonore lived. The letter was written the same year Sunnylands was completed. So it's interesting to me that this lovely girl in storage was in the back of his mind as they completed the estate. Walter wrote the letter to the chief curator of paintings and sculpture at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Walter requested a full evaluation of a white marble statue that he called Diana. Now, Walter, at the time of his request, was on the board of trustees of this museum, and his father before him had also served on the board, and together they gave tens of millions of dollars to the museum over the years. The curator inspected and evaluated the sculpture and sent Walter a very formal written report, which we were thrilled to find. But sadly, the evaluation was not a positive one. In fact, the sculpture really received an F grade. First of all, he corrected Walter. Walter had called her Diana in his letter, and the curator said one must not call her Diana because Diana would always be carrying a bow and arrow. So in classic sculpture, that's true. And you know what, you guys? Walter would have known this. So he had his own witty or sly reason to christen this girl Diana, or maybe his father did, or maybe Leonore did, I don't know, but they stuck to it. The curator went on to say that the material itself is of very poor quality because, quote, the marble has only a few veins in the base, which, as I learned from this letter, apparently a bad thing to not have a lot of marbling in your marble. I had no idea. He went on to say that the artist, quote, must certainly have lost interest along the way after he fashioned the upper torso and drapery, which is why it is not signed. He estimated that the sculpture was made between 1880 and 1890, very specific. So she's a neoclassic girly, and really the same age as the Cranes, interestingly. The curator added, quote, you should not offer it to a museum, but rather install it in a garden because the rain won't hurt it. He also added, quote, Walter, you should probably not destroy it. As if that could even be a consideration, right? So my goodness, the curator had the lowest regard for this sculpture. So Walter sat with this bad report card for 4 years. And despite the formal criticism, Walter decided to ship the piece to Sunnylands anyway. Walter's interest in a work considered inferior by an expert tells me that this sculpture certainly had a sentimental pull on him. Diana was installed in this very private family space at Sunnylands. She sat near the indoor swimming pool, which was right off of the primary bedroom. And for those of you who are curious about that indoor pool, Leonore had it removed 5 years after Walter's passing, and in its place, a sitting room was created that we call the Inwood Room. You might have seen this on tours. That's where the pool was. So in the end, our girl Diana found a lovely place to spend her days when Fred Fisher, who built the center building, they also built this lovely pool pavilion on the west end of the property to house retreat meetings. And it was built in 2014. We thought this would be the perfect site for Diana to enjoy. A new pedestal was built for her so she can look upon the scene from her special perch. And after all the insults she endured, and after spending years in storage, and after long travels, she was finally placed within a garden as the curator had recommended nearly 50 years earlier. And Diana is definitely not bothered by the rain here in our beautiful desert. So in closing, the final structure the Annenbergs designed for their estate was their own memorial pavilion, at which they would together be laid to rest. The design of the pavilion references the famous pyramid-inspired house that they together built. They ensured that their final resting place would be designed and sited exactly as they wished. Their memorial pavilion is nestled lakeside, not far from their pair of cranes. You can see it there between the cranes. So having spent 15 years in their archives, as I said earlier, I have no doubt in my mind that the Annenbergs enjoyed every single minute spent at Sunnylands. They booked their social calendar every weekend during season, and they golfed regularly with others throughout the week. The Annenbergs appreciated that they were very lucky in life. She once said, quote, I've been very lucky and I never forget it. And he said, my country has been very good to me, so I must be very good to my country. So I feel like what they dreamed, they built, and what they built, they used. And then they gave it all away, and they gave it to us. They spent their golden years trying to strategize the best way to use their good fortune to advance the greater good. Their choice to donate Sunnylands to a public trust, ensuring that it be publicly accessible forever, is just one example of their heroic philanthropy, which has enlivened the desert as well as the world. Thank you for joining me today on this little outdoor adventure.
For those who have questions, we do have a little bit of time. We'll be taking some questions too. Usually in these talks we have those.
Any questions?
No.
Oh, here's one.
Oh, there is one down here. So you stay right there.
That is Anna, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Okay, you do that.
So could you address the pink wall that surrounds the property and whether it's just urban legend or truth that Leonore demanded the pink wall against the wishes of the Rancho Mirage City Council?
Oh my gosh. I don't know the politics behind it, but Mick's probably better suited to answer this one.
We actually have documents of the newspaper articles in that time, and I think over the years it has been built up into something much larger than it was. They actually went to the city council. The council gave them some options. They didn't like the options. They were more brown tones.
Yeah.
And so they went back and said, this is the tone we would like, and it was agreed on. So we get a lot of that, though.
There's a lot of urban myths. There's
Yes.
a lot of urban myths.
Any
around
other
the property.
questions? Okay. Any other questions? Right behind you, TJ.
Do you have any hope of finding information on the cranes? I mean, have you been through, in 15 years, everything?
It's such a good question, and yes, we have been through everything, but it's a matter of confirmation bias and attention bias, because we went through everything in rapid succession when we first got there. We didn't know what we had, we didn't know what we were going to say, we didn't know anything about anything, and so we quickly went through just to get the major artworks sort of nailed down to where they came from, what their provenance was. But for instance, Diana, we just in 2000, I want to say it was 2014, found in a shipping file those documents about her journey. And so I'm hopeful that now when we go back for a second pass through everything, looking for the more obscure things, we had to really solidify a large narrative in the beginning. And I know how we did that, and I also know that we did it pretty quickly. And so I think that when we go back through every operational, there'll be something that shows when those cranes arrived, how they were crated. I mean, I can't imagine everything got thrown away. So yes, I'm hopeful that we'll find something. Yes. Oh my gosh. What's the most surprising thing we found in the archives? There are too many to list, but one of the delightful things was one day our archivist and librarian walked into my office, and he was just white as a sheet. And he was holding a file, and I don't know if you know the artist Andrew Wyeth, one of America's greatest painters, right? And we, of course, have an Andrew Wyeth in the Room of Memories. But he said he opened the file, and there were 2 original Andrew Wyeth watercolors in the file. Andrew Wyeth had done some beautiful watercolors as his Christmas card to the Annenbergs, and they put it in a Christmas card folder. We alerted the Andrew Wyeth Foundation, here are 2 more artworks you might not know about. So that was a fun day. I actually took a picture of Frank in that moment because he was just absolutely gobsmacked.
Any other questions back here? Oh.
There's been a couple exhibits that I really liked. One was the pictures of the birds. Oh, okay. They had a series of photographs of the birds of Sunnyland, and then another time you did the China and how she entertained. And I wondered, do you ever recycle those exhibits? Because I think they ought to be shared more. I mean, not just those specific, but do you recycle exhibits is my question.
Thank you. Do we recycle the exhibits? Do we repeat them? Not yet. We're pretty new, and so we're still showing novel content every year. But I think about curators in their 50 years from now, and if they'll reprise any of our exhibitions. I do wonder if that will happen, but we still have enough content, we feel, to have novel content. But I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the reasons we decided to keep exhibitions up 2 seasons, because we find that people come in, well, I want to see the dishes, or I want to see the Haynes furniture, and it's gone. Because we can't all get to the museum all the time, right? So
the bird exhibition, however, because we're on an endowment, we have a little bit more freedom with funds. So that bird exhibition went to Coachella Valley History Museum and High Desert Museum free of cost. And our team, we went and installed it for them at both sites. So it did go longer than at Sunnylands.
And that was our first natural history exhibition, and our second one is following the Haynes exhibition. So Mickaleen is the curator of our next exhibition, and just like she curated the bird exhibition, which was fine art photography of the birds at Sunnylands, she's taken on the trees at Sunnylands, and they've been photographed by a very famous London photographer in a very artful way, so look forward to that. We'll be taking the Haynes exhibition down this summer.
And I think we have time for one more in the back, yeah. That's you.
You alerted the Wyeth Foundation of the 2 watercolors. Can I ask,
Yes.
Does that mean you gave them to the foundation, or do you hold on to them?
You know, we didn't donate them because they're so Sunnyland specific. I think if we found something that had nothing to do with us, and we could not make any interpretive use of that contextually for our institution, we'd certainly think about deaccessioning them to a museum that can use them. But because these were written to Walter and Leonore, and the names Walter and Leonore are scrolled, is very site-specific for us, so we feel it makes sense for us to be the stewards of them. But them being aware of them, they could go on an exhibit. I mean, they're in the milieu now, you know, they're in the documents, so we wanted them to be aware that they exist. Good question, thank you.
And
All right,
that
well,
was
thank
our
you.
last one.
Thank you, everybody. Hi, let me come down.